Hi, I'm Kim Sash, Biological Monitoring Coordinator here at Tall Timbers Research Station.
I'm Dwayne Elmore. I'm the Director of the Game Bird Research Program at Tall Timbers Research Station.
So today we're going to talk about some trade-offs with prescribed fire. Those trade-offs are often related to what species you're managing for. So is it bobwhite quail, or are you going to manage for herpetofauna? So that would be all of your reptiles and amphibians. And the best way to balance may be trying to have both and maintain biodiversity when you're doing prescribed burns. So today we're on Tall Timbers Research Station. This is the property that we conduct most of our research on, and we're standing in mostly old field upland habitat. So habitat that is good for quail, but also good for a lot of reptile and amphibian species. So most of our upland species, we think of reptiles. So thinking diamondback rattlesnakes, corn snakes, gray rat snakes, pine snakes. But the most important part about this habitat is that, as you can tell, we've got sunlight to the forest floor. So that is creating great places for ectotherms to thermoregulate. So they have places where they can be out in the sun or they can move to the shade. And we also see at this time of year a lot of seeds. So that's creating a great dynamic food web, feeding some of the smaller mammals, which a lot of our snakes like to eat.
So Kim, you said a term that maybe some folks aren't familiar with. What is an ectotherm?
Ectotherms, so those are cold-blooded species. So those are species that their temperature is regulated by their environment.
So having a sunny spot and a shady spot in close proximity, is that important for them?
Yes, very good for them, yeah. So they need those shady spots if they get overheated, but they like a warmer spot, like if they just ate like a big rat, for example, that the sunlight will help them digest that meal.
And there's a wetland behind us. Yeah. Although it's not wet right now, how does that play into the habitat needs for some of these species?
Yeah, so wetlands obviously really important for our amphibians. Those are where they're going to lay their eggs. We have mostly winter breeding amphibians, some summer breeding amphibians as well, but hopefully, you know, we're in the fall right now, but that and kind of our drier season for this area. But winter cold fronts should start occurring, and that wetland will fill up. And once it does, a lot of our species, our innate chorus frogs, our tiger salamanders, are going to start making the migration down into that wetland. And I always say they jubilee, they do their thing, and then they lay their eggs, and so that creates an aquatic larva, your tadpoles or your larval salamanders that live in that wetland, and then transform into adults and move out into this upland environment.
So we have these embedded wetlands within an upland kind of ecosystem. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
So that's important because this part of the world, as a lot of the Southeast historically was, is really important for bobwhite. So bobwhite are a ground nesting and ground occupying bird. They spend almost all their life on the ground. So when you're thinking about bobwhite, you really need to be thinking about everything kind of below your shoulders down to the ground. And they have seasonal habitat requirements. Every species has different habitat requirements, and bobwhite overlap with some others like wild turkey and white-tailed deer, but they also have some unique things about them that sets them apart, that makes them unique. And some of the main characteristics of bobwhite habitat is that they need some type of nesting cover. They nest on the ground, so litter and typically grass, but they'll also nest under shrub. But they need some type of cover to park under, and that protects them from predators, but it also protects them from the sun because they're basically glued to that spot for 20-something days until those eggs hatch. So that's kind of the first part of their main year, you know, going into the breeding season. If they're successful and hatch, the chicks are tiny. You know, they're like little bumblebees. They have a hard time thermoregulating. So just like these amphibians, it's really important for them to be able to get into the sun, dry off, but also get into the shade, cool off. And for the first week or so, they're pretty much dependent on the adult to provide that service for them, to basically brood them. And during that time, they're very vulnerable to temperature fluctuation and being wet. They're also gorging on insects, so they need a lot of insects, and these insects need to be easy to catch and close to the ground. So they'll tend to be in these what we call brood areas, brood habitat areas, where there's a lot of insects. There's overhead cover, but it's very open at ground level so that these very small birds can move and navigate and capture their food. And then Once they're adults going into the fall as coveys, these unified groups of quail, they're really looking for seeds for food, and that's a lot of things like ragweed and partridge pea, maybe acorns in some years, and they're using shrub cover to protect themselves from predation and also the weather. But predation is a constant threat, so they need to be under dense shrub cover, and all of those things need to be in close proximity. These birds do not have large home ranges, they're not migratory, so we try to get all those elements in close proximity in the same point in space. And since we're talking about all this ground cover, the overstory matters, because if you have too much shade, if you have too many trees and it's shading out the understory, then all this important herbaceous and shrub cover disappears. So that's why we do not see bobwhite in closed canopy forests. They need open forest or open fields that have this abundant shrubby herbaceous understory.
Herps in the southeast, like we're talking about a very diverse array of species that live in a very diverse array of habitats. So I think that's why this conversation is so important, is because, when you're looking at burning your land, every place is going to be different because you're going to have a different suite of species. But if we're talking about this environment, the environment behind me, piney woods with some hardwood component, having it open, for most species, we're talking about 40 to 60 basal area to keep it open enough, managed with single tree selection in this case. The real important part about the pine trees is mainly needle cast to carry the fire across the environment. So you have you have an environment that burns really well. But these can also be a mosaic burn where you can leave some patches that are unburned, and that's good for a lot of amphibians and reptiles that are seeking refugia. They have these thicker areas where they can go to during a prescribed fire and escape that prescribed fire. Also just creates a more dynamic habitat for them with lots of areas for foraging and for refuge.
So Kim picked up on two really important things from a silvicultural standpoint, forest management standpoint, that are relative to bobwhite. The basal area, which is basically how many square feet of stem, kind of at your breast height in an acre. So if it's 40, that means if you took the cross section of all these trees in an acre and summed them up, there's 40 square feet versus 100 square feet. So for bobwhite in pine woods, we're generally recommending somewhere between 30 and 60. So, somewhere in that range, because once you cross about 60 basal area, typically the shade that I mentioned earlier starts to really matter and really limit that undergrowth. You can go less than 30. Bobwhite don't need the pines per se, but as Kim said, that pine needle cast really helps carry a fire. And hardwoods it's a delicate balancing act for bobwhite. They need shrubs. They are a shrub obligate. They are not a grassland bird. They're a shrub obligate, but shrubs are low. And if you don't burn these frequently, like every 2 years or 3 years if it's a sorry site index, but generally every 2 years, this stuff escapes the fire. It becomes mid-story, and that shades everything out. It provides predator perches like raptor perches, and so pretty quickly it moves away from being habitat for bobwhite. So there is a delicate balancing act to get enough fire intensity that fuel from those needles helps us to keep the shrubs down low where we want them. And
this stand was burned in April, so you can already see how much growth we've had in just a few months.
And by this time next year, which we're at the end of the summer, end of the growing season, but a year from now, if this is still unburned, it'll be pushing it. So, it's time to burn again. The other thing you said was a mosaic. And I mentioned earlier that bobwhite have very small home ranges. So having a mosaic of different cover types, patch types, different time since fire in close proximity. Most bobwhite will spend the majority of their life on 50 to 100 acres. They're not moving very far. They can, but most of them don't. So we generally try to get these burn patches small as practical. And I know this is a difficult thing, but burning 500 acres, unless it's just really patchy because there's a lot of fire refugia in it, you're not optimizing or you're not maximizing that area for bobwhite. But if you could get your burns 50 acres or smaller, that's generally the sweet spot. So a lot of these properties that are intensively managed for bobwhite, they have very small burn units. They might be 20, 30, 40, 50 acres, but but certainly smaller is generally better.
Yeah, and I think that for reptiles and amphibians, smaller would be better as well. You know, those big, we're talking about species that don't really move far. I mean, for some of these species, even moving 100 yards is a big movement for them. So I think the smaller burn units are better for them as well. Yep. Yeah, so we align.
Yeah, so far it doesn't seem like there's much conflict.
No.
They both do well in fire adapted systems.
Yeah. Season of burn is another thing with reptiles that is, and amphibians is complicated. And again, it's going to be very site specific. So it depends on the type of wetlands you have, the type of soil you have. So that'll kind of determine what kind of reptiles and amphibians you have on your landscape. So, you know, it's hard for me to make an overall prescription of what you should do without, you know, looking at a specific piece of property, which is true, I assume, for bobwhites.
Yeah, I mean, most people are trying to burn most of their woods, you know, in late winter, early spring for bobwhite. And the reason, there are several reasons. One, they're trying to get, you know, you have to set back plant succession or it advances such that it's not bobwhite habitat anymore. So you have to use prescribed fire. But if you burn in the middle of the winter, then they've got all winter that basically whatever you burned is unavailable for cover. So we generally wait as long as we can to give them cover, hopefully to let most of the predators move out of the area, the migratory predators like raptors. And also we get close to spring where that when you burn, it's quickly going to regrow. And so there's a shorter time where that area is a moonscape. So that, you know, that kind of late winter, like late February, March, even into April, May, that works really good for bobwhite because you're kind of finding a sweet spot where vegetation quickly rebounds, so it's not bare very long, and it's before they're really nesting, so you're not, you know, you're not impacting a significant number of birds that might have eggs on the ground.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that everything has to be burned during that window.
Exactly.
But a lot of the burns are concentrated during that time.
Yeah. And that's why I think, you know, this stand in particular is a good one for us to be standing in front of when we're talking about this, because we do burn this stand later into the you know, April, May, because of this wetland right here. And so what we want to have happen is give enough time for all the reptiles and amphibians that are in that wetland. We want to give them time to move out and have vegetation cover in order to move out of that wetland after they transform. Also have them kind of establish like a safe place to be. And then if we were to burn earlier this spot with like a ephemeral wetland in it, a lot of those species would be moving through a landscape that is already burned, so they don't have any cover when they're moving, so they obviously can be very easily picked up by predators. And oftentimes that's when our ponds are full of water. And so then the fire is hitting that water and extinguishing. And so that's when you start getting problems with your wetlands, and management with your wetlands gets really complicated. So for typically, like the later in the summer you can push things for reptiles and amphibians, the better.
Yeah, and so I think that's really important point is that if you're trying to maximize every square inch of this place for bobwhite and you're burning in February, March, or April, a lot of times these wetlands don't get burned at all because, like you said, they're full of water that time of year and the fire extinguishes. So what happens over time? They become forest. Whereas historically, a lot of these were herbaceous wetlands. They were pretty open, maybe some shrubs, but not full of sweet gums. Or, you know, now we have invasives like privet that'll just be in the understory. And privet loves areas that are fire excluded. So you end up with these sweet gum overstories, privet understories, which is not good for amphibians, you're telling me. No. And it's terrible for bobwhite because it harbors a lot of predators and that stay in that wetland in the day and move out and feed at night. And so they're picking off eggs, they're picking off adults. So again, it sounds like there's not a lot of conflict here because bobwhite don't need that to grow up into hardwoods, nor do amphibians.
Yeah. And the point about it growing up into hardwoods, just so everybody's clear about why that's not good for amphibians, is that there's a food web inside that wetland, and so having that herbaceous layer, so sun getting to that forest floor of the wetland even, is going to create that herbaceous layer, and that's going to eventually feed the insects that are in there, that are going to feed the amphibians that are in there, create algae, all that sort of stuff that everything's going to feed, and creates this dynamic food web. If that's shaded out, we end up losing that whole food web. Kind of falls apart, because the sunlight again is what is driving that whole system, and you lose that, and then it's a lot of those species aren't going to breed in there anymore. And then the grass and all those herbaceous, aquatic herbaceous and emerged or so subsurface in the water herbaceous plants are where they're egg deposition sites for your amphibians. They also are escape cover for them, just like we need escape cover for quail. The amphibians need that to be able to avoid predators. So without getting fire through the wetland when it's dry, that's when you end up having management issues, and it's not an easy task.
So up until this point, it sounds like these bobwhite and this group of amphibians, there's not a lot of conflict, but there can be. Mm-hmm. And I think you've hinted at where it's at. If we're trying to maximize bobwhite and we're burning all these uplands in February, March, mm-hmm. and those wetlands aren't getting fire ever,
because they're full of water.
They're full of water. Then over time, they become hardwoods. Mm-hmm. The easy fix from a quail standpoint is just to wait till it's dry in the summer, go in there with heavy equipment like a dozer, mm-hmm. and pile it up and burn it. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens a lot of times. Mm-hmm. So that works for quail, just periodically set it back. But you're going to tell me that that's not perfect for amphibians.
Well, it's not perfect. I mean, a lot of these are fossorial creatures. They go subsurface, even in the wetlands. And so we're creating a lot of soil compaction, creating a lot of soil disturbance, especially, introducing a lot of areas where exotics can come in, where fire ants can move in. So that's not ideal. I mean, fire is ideal. And what we do in this stand in particular, like this year, every year is different. Some years it's dry in April and we can burn right through it. It's not an issue. This year it was a very wet spring, and that wetland had water in it. So we waited as long as we could to burn this stand, but you hit a wall where your hardwoods are leafing out and it's not going to really carry a fire as well. So we decided to burn this stand, even though it was still wet in the wetland, but then we came back and we can burn it again later. And that's optimal if you can do that.
How about we go down there and look at it and talk about some different strategies that we might be able to compromise.
Yeah.
All right, Kim, so now we've stepped into this wetland, and we were talking about this issue of the hardwoods kind of getting away mm-hmm. from the fire. And even though on this site we're trying to let the fire come in, sometimes it gets away. So what happened here?
So it's many years of a wetland that had water in it for we call them ephemeral wetlands, so they're supposed to be wet weather ponds, so they're not. This isn't a permanent wetland. But, some cases it is. Some years it stays wet for many years and we're not going to get fire in here. And as we've seen, if you don't get fire in there, you get a lot of hardwood growth. And so that's what happened in this case. And we eventually decided that the best move was to come in here with a piece of small equipment with a mower on it and mow some of these hardwoods down, just so we could start reintroducing fire. I do a lot of wetland restoration, and people always ask me, how often should I burn my wetland? And I tell them, plan on burning it every year, because it's never going to happen. I mean, you're always going to have a wet year that you're not going to be able to burn it. But if you plan for it every year, then at least you know that it's on the docket and it's something that you always want to do. So when it's wet, you can take advantage of that, because coming in and doing the work like this is, it's extra. Just applying prescribed fire is very easy. But the nice thing is that we mowed it all down. We got those hardwoods. We let that sit for, like a week or so before we came in, so it was all dry. And then we burned it. And since we had burned these uplands in April, we don't have to put a fire break in. It hit this vegetation that had been recently burned and naturally extinguished. So it's a very easy way to set a fire. And we didn't even, I mean, we literally drove around and basically ringed it. We were able to walk away almost. There was no fire escaping into the uplands, which is nice.
So the year that the surrounding uplands are burned, if the conditions are right, the wetland might burn. But if it doesn't, what you're saying, then you can come back later at some point when that wetland does go dry, because they're ephemeral, which means not always wet, not always flooded, and then put the fire on it in the summer, because basically you've got a fire break all around it, because that area doesn't have fuel, it hasn't accumulated fuel. And there's going to be little to no quail use in those small isolated ephemeral wetlands that are becoming too brushy anyway. So that's not really even a rub with the quail management by burning that small area during the summer. So that sounds like kind of a win-win.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't burn and you can't get to it and you have to come in here with mechanical, what are some recommendations that we could do from a quail management standpoint and from a herp standpoint to get that woody cover down, make it herbaceous again without compacting that soil? How would you do that?
Yeah, so we try to use very small equipment. We try for it to be dry. If you're rutting, you need to get out and you need to let it dry out. So you want it to be, very dry. Use the smallest piece of equipment that you can. We have done even hand clearing in the past, and I may come in here by hand and remove some trees that are just bothering me still, that we couldn't get to because it was still too wet. But
how about a track vehicle?
Yeah, a track vehicle is great. That's very low ground impact. So
rubber tracks.
Rubber tracks. Whenever you can use one of those, if you have access to one of those, those work really, really great. Yeah. The only thing else that I would say, though, is that, we managed this wetland for many, many years with nothing but fire. And wetlands are very dynamic. Like, they're constantly changing. They're getting deeper. They're getting shallower. They're getting bigger. They're getting smaller. So new wetlands are forming. I mean, we have areas of sinkholes where wetlands are forming. So just because something has always worked, and just because we could always get fire in, and just because we never had to use anything else, doesn't mean that you should only manage that way. You always have to be adaptive in what you're doing based on the conditions that you have, and nothing on your landscape is ever going to stay the same.
Yeah, everything's dynamic, and even from a quail standpoint, I think you have to have that in mind. Is we give these general prescriptions like burn every 2 years, but sometimes you need to burn more frequently. Sometimes you may need to back off. You really need to look at the vegetation and know what quail habitat looks like. In general, 2 years in the coastal plain is the sweet spot. You can't be burning every 3 or 4 years, or you've lost it. But changing it up a little bit can matter from time to time. And as a quail manager, I'm sitting here thinking about something you said earlier, where you tried to burn the wetland every year. Well, clearly we don't want to try to burn the whole uplands every year because there's no nesting cover for quail. But there's ways to be creative about that. You could pick a time of, as you said, if it doesn't burn, go back in later and burn. But in those off years, when the uplands didn't get burned and you've got that risk of escape, that's a tricky time if you're trying to put fire in. But what I've seen a lot of people successfully do, you can't do this with every wetland, but if you're creative, a lot of these wetlands can become the fire break boundary, or the boundary between two adjacent fire units. So in other words, behind me is one fire unit, across the wetland becomes another fire unit, and the break is right between them.
Yeah.
And so what ends up happening in that situation is, in odd years when this is burned, we let it burn into the wetland, and our actual break is maybe on the other side. That's where we defend it. And in even years, we're burning across the wetland and letting it burn into the wetland, and our break, where we're defending it, is here. So every year, it's potentially, and it doesn't always go in, but if you're upping your odds that it will burn, maybe every other year or something, and if you miss it, then you can come back and hit it in the summer and burn the rest of it. So I do think, even thinking about from a quail standpoint, trying to burn the landscape in a mosaic every 2 years, most of these wetlands, we can make that work and still put fire in those wetlands every single year and maintain the mosaic of unburned and burned in the uplands for quail.
Yeah. And I even had, our tractor operators just even mow a line all the way around this, and we burn off a mowed line. Instead of, people put fire breaks around their wetlands, but I just, and in most cases that's not the management that you need to do. It may make it safer, it may make it easier, but it's not always necessary to disturb that soil like that. I mean, and as somebody that cares about the little things that are crawling across the landscape, that soil disturbance is really promoting fire ants, other exotics, and so the less we can do that, I mean, a salamander that's leaving a wetland, fire ants will get on it and kill it while it is leaving. So, the less ground disturbance we can do, the better.
So what I'm hearing is try to put fire in that wetland as often as possible, and be creative on how you do it. And if you have to get in there with mechanical, use the smallest, lightest tracked vehicles you can, and potentially even you could use herbicide. We talked a lot about mechanical, like bringing it down, but could you not use a UTV with a sprayer? And
oh, definitely. We have done that, and we did that before we mowed it. We actually herbicided a lot of this wetland just to see what we could do with herbicide before we brought in mechanical. And we got a lot of it, and there was some areas that we could skip on mowing because the herbicide took care of it. But I think, use all the tools, yeah.
So I can imagine people thinking, well, this sounds like it's getting really complicated. So a couple of points. One, you have to pick tangible, specific objectives on your property. You cannot say, I'm going to manage for everything simultaneously. You can do that, but you're probably not going to be very successful for anything. You might have a little bit of everything, but if you're trying to have high densities or high populations of certain taxa or certain groups of taxa, you really need to think about the specific habitat requirements and I would say pick as few objectives as possible. I generally tell people, unless you own hundreds of thousands of acres, you're the U.S. Forest Service, if you're the average landowner, 50, 100, 500 acres, you need to pick 2 or 3 wildlife species and really hone in on them. That might be a rare species that is of concern. That might be a species you want to hunt. That might be something you're just really passionate about. But pick something and understand everything there is to know about those 2 or 3 and then go after it. Because you can see how, even just talking about bobwhite and this small group of amphibians, it gets complicated quick. Imagine trying to do this for 20 species or 50 species. It's not possible. So, not to do it well. So once you know what your species are, it becomes less complicated. And, we've talked about different firing strategies and defending different parts of this wetland. But the listeners may be thinking, well, y'all have got an army of people. But that's not true.
Yeah,
how many people are burning this?
Yeah, we burn with 2 people.
On how many acres?
4,000 acres.
Yeah.
But, this is a specific unit, and I don't know how big it is. I'm guessing it's 30, 40 acres, but this has got a road all the way around it. And so we burn off the road, and the thing is that we would do here is that if the wetland is dry next year, we'll burn this block again, and it becomes a 1-year rough, which may not be ideal for quail, but it's not bad for quail. I mean,
they'll use it for something.
Yeah, they'll use it. So it could be a 1-year rough 2 years in a row, because we care about this wetland, we care about tiger salamanders, we want to manage that because our objective is to manage our wetland. And your objective too, I mean, you're talking about managing for specific species, but you can just manage for a specific habitat or a specific aesthetic that you like. If you want an open grassy wetland, then you can follow these parameters as well.
Right, you just need to pick what your objective is and understand it and make sure your prescriptions match that objective and then stick to the prescription.
Yeah.
And then just realize that there's going to be winners, hopefully the ones you're managing for, and species that don't do so well because they have very different habitat requirements. And if the whole world is managing with fire at different intervals and strategies, then by default all those species would have space. But on an individual property, I think people need to really hone in and say, this is what I'm going to manage for this small group of objectives, whether it's wildlife or aesthetics, fuels reduction, whatever it is, and then burn for effect.
Yeah. And this is, the latest that we would burn this wetland, the latest in the year that we would actually apply fire to this wetland, because we want a grass response. And so
latest being August, September?
Yeah, August, September. Well, August, yeah, September. We wouldn't burn into October. I would say August, September are like the latest into the summer, yeah. Because if we're not going to get a grass response, which is what we want, then it might as well just have hardwoods in it, and we're in a drought right now, so I'm not getting the response necessarily that I want. But in a typical year, you don't want to burn too late, just because you want that regrowth. And then more species will use it. Even quail will. They like these wetlands as well.
Oh yeah, they'll absolutely use the edges of these wetlands after they're burned, and so will turkeys. And there's a lot of forbs that'll start coming up that white-tailed deer will use the edge. Dove will come in here and eat grass seed. Yeah, there's a lot of terrestrial wildlife species that will use these wetlands during the dry periods.
Yeah, how dry is too dry to burn a wetland? That is a good question. And that's going to depend on your specific wetland. If you're burning your wetland every year, every other year, you're really not going to have, that duff layer, that organic layer of buildup in the bottom of your wetland. So you really don't need to worry about it being necessarily too dry. And some of our cypress domes, like if you want to keep your cypress, that gets a little bit hairier, because your cypress obviously don't like fire, and so you're making them susceptible to fire. But in a system like this, I would say it really, it can't be too dry necessarily. But if it's a wetland that you're reintroducing fire into and it hasn't had fire for many years, that's a lot more complicated question. And you want to look at your duff layer and see how much you have, and think about, sometimes it's almost better to burn those when it's a little bit wetter, slowly reintroduce that fire over multiple years.
That so you're trying to reduce the duff over time?
Yeah. So, ideally, you want these wetlands to be bare mineral soil. That's what we want to have in the bottom of them, is bare mineral soil. So if you don't have bare mineral soil, that complicates things. And that's honestly probably a good time, like if you're not familiar with burning, to bring in an expert and say, will you look at this wetland? I want to reintroduce fire. Like, what are my steps to do that? Because that gets really complicated, and smoke issues, things like that really complicate, doing that. When we are burning these wetlands, we don't look for a very intense fire. You don't need a really hot, intense fire to burn these wetlands. We're looking to, consume some of that organic matter. Obviously, if we have a hardwood issue, you want to pop those stems and get that hardwood top kill. But for the most part, hopefully you're just burning up grasses. And so your fire intensity does not need to be, I'm not saying ring it and get 10-foot flames in here. That's not necessary. You can easily have like a low petering fire, which is pretty much what happened through here, is that the fire just we let it do its thing, and it extinguished in places, and that's fine. So it can be a really low intensity fire moving into the wetland. And we did talk about, a lot of people, and this is really kind of an older practice that we see in the Red Hills, in this region, was that everybody thought that fire in wetlands at one point was a bad thing. And there is somewhat that mentality out there that you don't want to put fire into your wetlands. But as we're looking at, as a lot of our amphibians and reptiles are very rare species, and that's somewhat because the habitats that they need are not managed for them, and people didn't recognize the importance of fire to an amphibian, which to some people sounds really crazy, that you're talking about a little slimy thing walking on the ground that actually needs fire. But these are fire adapted species, and so at that point people put fire breaks around these wetlands, so fire was not allowed into them. And we're actually standing on one of those old fire breaks right now that has been abandoned and we don't use anymore. But this area where people put those fire breaks is often where you see a lot of those really rare and endangered plants that live in that ecotone. Like pitcher plants, for example, or your sundews. They live in that transition zone, and so it's really exciting to manage these ecotones, get a lot of sunlight to the forest floor. And, you know, a lot of this stuff, after we've restored some of these wetlands, we've seen a lot of these rare species come up that have just persisted in the seed bank, and they just needed time and no soil disturbance to actually pop up. And it's amazing how resilient all this stuff is. We have another wetland that we restored on Tall Timbers that I thought maybe we'd have to seed in some plants, but all of those wetland species, once we got the sunlight there, all of those plants germinated. I had never documented tiger salamanders in that wetland, and bam, the next year tiger salamanders are breeding in there. So salamanders are cool too, because unlike quail, they can live a long time. And so we're talking about a species that could live like 12 years. And so they might be able to persist in conditions that are not really optimal for them, but you restore that wetland, you restore that habitat, and bam, you know, sometimes they're just already there, which is amazing.
So when you're talking about ecotone, that's this transition between wetland and the terrestrial, the upland site.
Yeah.
And besides it being important for plants that are often pretty rare, that only can occur in that transition zone, and the importance of getting the fire to carry across it, so not putting a hard fire break, but letting the fire into the wetland. Are there some other issues, like having that bare, disked up, or hard packed soil? Does that inhibit the movement of amphibians from the wetland to the terrestrial zone?
Definitely. And that's again where we see a lot of the exotic species pop up because of that soil disturbance. And, you know, they're just susceptible to predation when they're moving across there. They're very susceptible if it's, you know, usually they're moving at night in a rainstorm. So usually, you know, they don't get picked up by predators on that fire break, but I would say fire ants are definitely an issue. And so if you want to keep fire ants off your landscape, I would reduce that soil disturbance, especially in those ecotones. I mean, those fire ants love that kind of moister environment.
Yeah, and even if you're just focusing on quail, having that ecotone where it's a smooth, gradual transition where fire goes in is really important, because as a quail manager, I can tell you what I found happening a lot of times is, you know, we're burning the uplands, we're keeping it in good condition, but we were stopping the fire at the wetland, and not only was the wetland lost, so to speak, it had become, you know, basically privet understory and that sweet gum overstory, but up the edge, on the edge, the privet and the sweet gum was creeping out into the uplands. So I found myself constantly having to beat it back with herbicide, and you know, one day I just thought, this is silly. Like, this is not good quail habitat to have this hard edge like this. You know, this is where raccoons are, this is where snakes are, there's raptors in the sweet gum. You know, why am I stopping this fire? Like, let the fire. So even just strictly from a quail management standpoint, it's very counterproductive to stop the fire at those wetlands. So I would encourage the quail manager to also let it burn.
Yeah. Don't create the crapatat, that's what I say.
All right, so we were in a wetland, and then we went to the ecotone, that kind of in between, and as we're stepping into the upland, we flushed quail. So clearly they're using this edge as well. There's food availability and there's cover all in close proximity. And then as we move into the uplands and think about quail and amphibians and reptiles. From a fire standpoint, when we were talking about the habitat requirements, it didn't sound like there was much of a conflict.
No, I think we get along in that.
Yeah. We did a pretty good job, I think, coming up with compromises in the wetland, but there are some potential rubs in the upland outside of fire specific, but things that might be associated with fire, like equipment. So you can talk a little bit about how equipment might, because we use a lot of equipment in quail management, and we have to use some level of equipment, but what are some potential conflicts with herps and amphibians?
Yeah, well, you know, tires will kill little things, and so it's good to keep ground compaction to a minimum, and it's good to think about what reptiles and amphibians you may have in your landscape that you're impacting. So if you've got gopher tortoises, for example, you might want to have those flagged or marked so you know that you can avoid them. We've done some research on looking at heavy equipment and gopher tortoises, and if you accidentally run over a gopher tortoise burrow, I'm not going to tell people that they killed it necessarily. I mean, a lot of times, especially in the summer, they can dig out, but it's better to be able to avoid them altogether. And we're talking about a species that's creating refugia for over 300 different species, including quail, have used gopher tortoise burrows for refugia. So, you know, you don't want to trap species down in there. And if you run those over, you could trap other species that aren't able to dig out.
Yeah, so clearly from a quail management standpoint, but even for a lot of these herptiles that you're talking about, herpetofauna, we've got to do some logging. We've got to take some overstory. That's critical, or it won't be pine savanna. And at times we have to use herbicide or mechanical to bring down brush that's escaped the fire. But what I'm hearing you say is at a minimum, try to identify those sensitive areas, like know where your gopher tortoise burrows are, mark those, make sure the equipment operators know where they're at and give them a wide berth, but also try to use fire as much as possible.
Yes.
Tracked equipment as little as necessary.
Yes.
Is that
the
take home?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I think we're right on board with obviously fire. I mean, fire is the most important thing you can do to your landscape. The other thing that quail managers do that you know, from a reptile and amphibian perspective is not great is picking up deadfalls and those sorts of things in the woods. Like, to me, having a dead tree laying on the ground, that's great nesting habitat for lizards, snakes, turtles, all of those species. So as people are picking up their woods, you know, that's not really the best practice.
And you know, there's a few reasons why they do that. One, obviously, ones that are on the fire break, they want to remove those because they're safety hazards about, you know, a snag catching on fire and falling over. That's kind of a no-brainer. But you're talking about just cleaning the whole woods up, going and getting all the snags. And you know, the rationale for that is that it harbors predators, which we do know that predators use those. But Tall Timbers is actually trying to do research right now to better understand how big of an impact does that make. Like, is it a significant enough predator attraction, and you know, how much effort should be put into removing those snags. So that is an area that we need to investigate more and give the managers more information.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I think we have to have a food web perspective when we're managing the forest, and so everything's connected. So it's better to at least retain most of the pieces, right? So I think us doing that research to better understand what are the impacts of cutting down your snags and removing your deadfalls, and those are things that are created by fire. So I think it's still important to talk about them, even though this is a fire-dominated presentation. But I think that it's good to understand that that's feeding that food web. Those habitats, those micro-habitats are really important.
Well, to me, I think the take-home from this conversation is that we've got...
herps are awesome, and quail...
Oh no, that is not at all what I was going to say. Not at all. Quail are super cool. That you've got a species, quail, that has pretty specific habitat requirements, fire dependent, and this group of species, some reptiles and amphibians that co-occur, that also need fire. They have some overlapping habitat, but they also have some differences. And so if you were trying to just completely maximize quail, it would not be perfect for a lot of these amphibians and herps. If you were trying to completely maximize some of those herps, it might not be perfect for quail, but there is a lot of room for compromise.
There's a lot
and you
of
can
overlap.
have high densities of both. But if we started to complicate that and
Yes.
have another 10 or another 20 species, it's pretty quickly going to get kind of out of control.
Yeah, and I pick on the quail, but you know, the reason that I get to work on all of these species here at Tall Timbers is because quail management has been such an integral part of Red Hills management and fire. And so, although I like to pick on you, I think that we overlap more than we differ.
Absolutely, and because of the intensive fire management for quail, a lot of these rare and sensitive species, not just the herpetofauna, but the plant diversity is thriving in these fire-dependent systems, whereas in other parts of the world that's not managed for quail, those species are absent. You can't find a lot. You can't find gopher tortoises or red cockaded woodpeckers or indigo snakes or pitcher plants or any of these other species.
Yeah, I've looked in center pivots and they're not there. When you think about the longleaf wiregrass ecosystem covering 93 million acres, and now what we have is restored habitat that was once an ag, how many more tiger salamanders would I have in that environment? I don't know. I mean, I don't know like the best way to answer that question, because I think that you can still potentially have it all. I mean, I think the wiregrass is a much different thing for quail, because you were talking about the shrub component being gone is much more important for quail. But I feel like the wiregrass, if it was all native habitat, then you know, most of the reptile and amphibian community is probably fairly intact because that's what they're adapted to. So I think it's mostly a quail thing.
Except maybe, what about the soils? So these are eroded, more compacted soil than it would have been. So that's got to change some of the.
Yes, well, that's what I'm saying. I think the longleaf wiregrass ecosystem would be, it's obviously very ideal as long as it's not very compacted. I mean, for reptiles and amphibians. We're standing in a restored landscape that was once heavily in agriculture, and when we think about burning in a longleaf wiregrass ecosystem that, you know, the wiregrass covered 93 million acres of the southeast, obviously from a reptile and amphibian perspective, that longleaf wiregrass ecosystem is obviously pretty idyllic for them. If there's not a lot of heavy equipment use and it's mostly maintained with prescribed fire, which is how most of that habitat is maintained, then you're not having that soil compaction from heavy equipment. And so those fossorial species especially are probably really thriving in that environment. And you can push your burns. You know, you have such a bigger burn window in a longleaf wiregrass ecosystem than you do in a restored old field ecosystem, when you're really going to have fires that are going to meet your objectives. So that burn window, being able to push that further into the summer, really is what reptiles and amphibians are adapted to. So it really benefits them. And I don't know how you feel about quail in that sort of environment.
Well, we definitely can effectively manage high densities of quail in the old field, the restored, and in the historic ground cover, the wiregrass, but they are different. So the wiregrass tends to be a hotter fire. I mean, we were talking earlier, needing the needle cast just to get a fire to carry. When you've got wiregrass, that's not a problem, because the wiregrass is also very volatile. So typically, we're not struggling to beat back the brush with wiregrass. In fact, sometimes we lose too much of it. You know, some of these wiregrass stands don't have enough shrub cover for quail. That's addressable. Like, you can back off a little or change your prescription and get it to brush up a little bit. But generally, you're not having to use much herbicide or supplemental heavy equipment. So that's one nice thing, is I'm not going to have to use other practices outside of fire nearly as much in a wiregrass stand as I do a restored old field site. You know, another I guess key difference is that, you know, in these old field sites, not only do we get a diversity of desirable forbs, but we often get a diversity of undesirable ones, exotics. So you tend to see a lot more exotic issues in these restored sites than we would in wiregrass. Wiregrass is very resilient to invasion. And so from a manager, it's, all things being equal, I would say it's easier and cheaper to manage wiregrass. But if you're not careful, you can run out of shrub or food in wiregrass. We can tweak it and make it work, and there's a lot of wiregrass stands that have tremendous quail numbers. Whereas in the old field, there's a lot of them that have tremendous quail numbers, and you're constantly beating back plant succession. It's really hard to keep it there, but you can make both work. So, you know, if I had my druthers as a quail manager, I would pick the wiregrass, because I know I'm going to use less herbicide and less mechanical. It's going to cost less. But that being said, I can make them both work, and they can be both tremendous quail hunting areas. And frankly, we don't have much wiregrass left. So when we're talking about restoring quail, we are absolutely focusing on this kind of stuff. The old field, trying to retain the wiregrass that we have left, but convert as much of other ground to this old field vegetation as we can, because that's where we're going to make a lot of bang for our buck with expanding quail populations.
So tell me this, if you had a wiregrass stand and you're managing for quail, would you still burn it at the same time you would burn our old field, or would you push it into the summer?
That's a good question. So a lot of recommendations are to burn wiregrass later.
Yes.
One, because you can,
yes,
and because it can help with hardwood encroachment, and two, because it won't set seed, it won't reproduce, it won't go into flowering if you burn it too early. I guess the first thing I would decide is, do I have enough wiregrass? Like, do I need it to flower? Do I need it to expand? Am I trying to fill in gaps? If so, I'd probably shift that more into the summer. Or am I losing the site to brush? If so, I might shift the burn more into the summer. But if I've got enough wiregrass, or maybe even too much wiregrass from a quail standpoint, and I need it to brush up, and I don't necessarily want more grass, then I would be perfectly fine with burning it early. I think the point is, don't get stuck in a rut.
Yeah.
Make the decision based on the vegetation you see on the ground.
Yeah.
But know that burning everything in May and June is not perfect for quail. They're nesting then, but burning portions of your property during that time, it's all scale dependent. You know, if you've got an area, it's like, you know, I really need that to be more grassy. I need the wiregrass to flower. I'm going to push that 50 acres to a May burn, but then right beside it, you did a March burn, and over here you've got an unburned. That works fine too. Yeah. It's really scale dependent. So
the other thing I've heard about burning wiregrass later, specifically for quail, is that it stands up better throughout the hunting season. So if you burn it early, all the grass starts falling down, and so it kind of impedes movement, versus burning it later, it's standing up better. And so you've got more maneuverability for those birds to walk through there.
Yeah, so if you've stimulated it to go into that reproductive, to send those culms up, the reproductive portion of the plant, a lot of that biomass, you're right, does tend to be more erect and allow for birds to move in the understory. So I think the point is, try to have some variation, you know, on the landscape. It's okay to have some, you know, areas that were burned at different times of the year, but let the vegetation kind of dictate